Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center today. Our second briefing will be dedicated to our power grid, its condition, and the situation in the energy sector in general. So let me introduce a speaker. Joining us in the studio is Yurii Boiko, advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine and member of the Ukrenergo Supervisory Board. Good afternoon, Mr. Yurii. Good afternoon. So I would like to start with something that is of concern to all of us. Recently, the Russians inflicted another massive strike on the energy sector of Ukraine, and we feel it that our power grid was under strike. So what are the consequences? Well, basically, this strike was focused on the power grid, and within the last couple of days, maybe a little bit more than a week, it's been a third massive strike. But what I would like to emphasize that the enemy's attempts to inflict strikes on our power grid, they are incessant. They continue on a daily basis. The residents of Chernihiv, Sumy, and basically Kyiv region on a daily basis, they see that number of air raid alerts, that number of offensive capabilities, the use of drones at large. So basically the nights that would pass without air raid alerts are not so numerous. Talking about the latest attack, basically it was also focused at some quite clear objectives. The key facilities of energy infrastructure ended up under the attack, both generation and transportation facilities. And talking about some specific things inherent in the last attack, they were focused on those facilities that are involved in export and import operations. I mean, the facilities that ensure the import of electric energy from our neighbors, and probably ideally they wanted to seek the full disconnection of Ukrainian power grid from European power grid. Talking about the softening of schedules, I understand that this is something of the biggest interest of our listeners. I would be cautious with any such forecast because we understand that all of the forecasts start with the word if. And the power technicians have proved it numerous times that in this war for light and heat, even in this uneven fight, because on one hand they use missiles and drones, and on the other hand we use the working hands, and our desire to maintain the energy infrastructure as well as the country in whole. So after a week or two, upon certain challenges, the power technicians were demonstrating the results of their work, and the consumers were feeling those results. That were expressed by either softening of the schedules or the suspension of the rolling power shutdown schedules. And again, I would like to give, so to say, the floor to the power technicians so they could prove everything by themselves, given the difficult weather conditions under which they have to restore the equipment. Well, I hope that shortly I'll try to be probably as unspecific as possible, but I hope that shortly the consumers will see the results of such work. What I would like to emphasize again, we have to react somehow to that information that pops up in the media, in Telegram channels, and even when it comes as the statements of some people in serious offices. There is a blame that so much funds were wasted to organize the defense of the power grid facilities, and still were suffered damages. Well, I would like to remind you a couple of things. Now we're in conditions when we cannot organize an excursion for everybody to demonstrate the results of the shellings, and it's difficult under such conditions to communicate things objectively to the people. Average citizens, they hardly understand what is the mainway substation or big power plant, for example, and mostly people associated with transformer booth. It somehow works and somehow provides electric power to one or two streets. Well, in fact, the area of the mainway substation with 220 volts voltage, or 360 or 400 or 750, it's about 15 to 20 football fields. When it comes to the key substations with higher voltage, it's about 20 to 70 football fields, where a couple of thousand pieces of equipment is stationed. So when we talk about the protection of the transportation facilities, it's mostly about the key ones. So a drone or missile strike one way or another would inflict damage on such equipment, but unlike the key equipment, which is protected, well, mostly the transformers, but not only them, one way or another sometime is needed to rectify the damage. And in order to attempt to explain the physical protection, not with the use of air defense capabilities, but with, say, concrete sarcophagus or other engineering contraptions, is quite an expensive thing. And when it comes to efficient protection against drones, let me put it like this. Just 10 by 10 meters would cost, the protection of a land plot 10 by 10 meters would cost about $1 million. So basically, this not so complicated example could answer the question, is it possible to protect the mainway substation completely against possible attacks by missiles or drones? When it comes to electric power plants that are also being targeted, the physical protection of electric power plants is something close to the protection of a big building, like 10 to 12 stories and about 10 to 12 blocks. So the task is to build a concrete sarcophagus on top of this building. So it's unrealistic from the engineering perspective. So theoretically, such task could be solved, but the question is, what costs more, the protection sarcophagus or the facility itself, let alone the resources to be involved and the terms of such works? So again, it goes without saying that when a drone or a missile breaks through the defense systems and they achieve their goals even without damaging the equipment it was targeting, still some time is needed to demine the territory, restore the auxiliary equipment that was damaged, and to restore the uninterrupted power supply to our citizens. In case of substations, it's even difficult We were discussing it a number of times in this studio. Mr. Yurii, lately, and not only lately, we're hearing the news that the generation had to be reduced in some power generators or power reactors. Does it say anything about any danger? To what extent does it influence the total capabilities of our power grid? Well, the reduction of intensity of operation of the nuclear power plant reactors is a result of shells. Well, basically, the system, due to the damage of certain components, let me put it like this, cannot accept all of the capacity that the reactor is capable of generating. How can it influence? I think that the answer is obvious. The reduction of generation as a result of incapability of the system to accept it results in reduction of capability to supply or capacity to supply the electric power to the final consumer. And the specifics of the system is that the dispatchers are supposed to maintain the balance between the consumed and generated power. It means that the less power was generated and transferred to the system, the less power can be supplied to the citizens. When such restrictions are significant, they are reflected in our consumers by imposition of more prolonged restrictions that are aimed at balancing of the system at that moment, given the capacity of the system to accept the power from the generating facilities. Thank you very much. The topic of export and import is very sensitive in terms of operation of a power grid. You mentioned that the last challenge was aimed at destabilizing, disrupting such capabilities. Well, there was no export within the last couple of weeks, and before that, quite small amounts were exported during night hours when there was certain excess of electricity in the system, and there were two ways to solve this task. Either the dispatchers had to restrict some generation, or some excessive amount could be exported. And those generators, those generating facilities who were not restricted could sell that excessive electric power that was not used inside of the country, and it provided some economic benefits to them, because the restrictions on generation result in increase of the cost of generation for final consumers. So export was quite technical, and it was exercised in small amounts during night hours. Talking about today in the context of the horizon by the end of the winter, Ukraine will be more interested in imports, and imports will be going on an ongoing basis. The maximum load on the system will be exercised to minimize the rolling power shutdowns. So we're having uneven amount of electric power during every single hour of the day, but within that range, the corridor of import continues to exist within the last couple of days. And you remember the allowed amount is 2100 megawatts. NCO expanded the corridor for imports to Ukraine and respectively hedged some of our risks related to inability to generate electric power inside of the country. By this moment, it's close to the technical maximum, at least until the consequences of the latest attack of the enemy on our energy infrastructure will be mitigated. So we have some reserves of import. Well, we're actively using it currently, in fact. Thank you very much. Another topic also important and quite intensively discussed today are the new schedules, the new shutdown schedules. They're discussed by everyone in the society. So let's talk about this new thing. What is the goal of such an update? How should it change and what does it influence? Well, the project of such changes, the draft changes were ready in the end of summer, but due to the number of organizational reasons, it was implemented or so to say legalized just recently. And I'm convinced that if we reduce that unclear hate, the changes are aimed at two goals: to increase the flexibility that would allow maximizing the number of hours with electricity for final consumers, and secondly is to ensure the equality and objectivity principles. So the changes are about the use of the graphs in the overall system all across the country without regard to the owner of the company or the region, because those companies are the operators of the distribution systems. They are not government controlled. Sometimes they have a complicated structure of owners represented by a number of business structures. So to unify standardize the approaches and to ensure the same duration and the same maximum duration of hours without the light in this or that region, and basically we can ensure the graphs are equal for every region. As a person enters the site in Kyiv, Chernihiv and Volyn regions, they see the same picture with the same drawing of application of those queues. Well, in practice, I'll try to explain it with simple words. If previously there was a discretion like 1 queue by queue, 1 queue is about 1000 megawatts, given the possibility to restrict 1500 megawatts like a deficit in the system. Starting from today, we may use 1.5 queues, not 2 of them, thus making it more convenient for some of the consumers, because it will be the period with the light. In some regions, such an approach was used when there are 2 hours with the light on, 2 hours with the light off. But in my opinion, that's my personal opinion, there is certain manipulation in such an approach, because when we talk about 4x4 scheme, we understand what is the human resource that is necessary to physically exercise the switching, because not all of the operations are done in automatic mode. Some of the works require involvement of physical personnel. The people do it with their own hands. They turn the switches or the feeders, and the scheme 2x2 contemplates twice more intensity of work. So with all due respect, it seems to me that on one hand, if it's really happening, it's not quite a rational use of human resources on one hand, and on the other hand, I would contest the possibility of use of such algorithm, and I would verify the information. Because when it comes to 4x4, again, it's even incorrect to say 4x4 because now there is a resolution in effect that the maximum duration or the minimum duration with the light on should be 3.5 hours, and half an hour on top of that for the operations. So when we talk about 3.5 hours, it's twice less manual work, twice less workload on that operational personnel that is involved in such operations, and thus such personnel can be used more efficiently. So on top of those non-traditional tasks that result from Russian aggression and the damage of infrastructure, the basic and the key task of this personnel is the maintenance and repair of the networks, and not the work related to the application of rolling power shutdown schedules. So using that standardized approach, we may achieve the compliance with the same rules in Ukraine, all over Ukraine, and we can achieve the maximum flexibility and the maximum number of hours with the light on for those consumers who could get disconnected theoretically, say yesterday. So this increase of iterations with the use of queues. There is a queue and there are sub-queues equivalent to 12 queues instead of 6 as it used to be yesterday. So it would allow us to ensure the maximum number of hours with the lights on for the final consumer, and equal number of hours with the lights off for all of the consumers. The task is to have it implemented within a week. Well, I think it would be a little bit difficult, but for those companies who maintain the rolling power shutdown queues, it would be easier. They try to balance this indicator to achieve this social balance for the final consumer. Well, you've mentioned an important component, the human resource, but there is also a technical resource that is also affected by this every 2 hours switch on and off. Well, of course, there are some technical parameters as the number of circuit breakers triggering, after which it may require maintenance. So again, you've properly mentioned that on top of improper or inefficient use of the human resources, that's again inefficient use of the technical resources. So we have this limited number of clicks, putting it in simple words, after which the scheduled maintenance should be exercised. Sometimes it's accompanied with oil replacement or something like that. So there's a lot of technical operations. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If you have any questions on the floor, take the microphone, please, and ask your questions. Well, now that we're having no questions, I would like to thank you for this conversation. Thank you for finding time to visit us, and we continue working together for our victory. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.